So, pleasure and happiness. We talked a little bit about it so far, about the relationship between these things, and about the view that we call hedonism about happiness. Hedonism about happiness, as Dan Hayburn points out, it's probably like the default view that people have about happiness in philosophy. Doesn't mean there's no disagreement, but often when people talk about happiness in philosophy writings, they will assume something like hedonism is true. And so, what is hedonism? In previous classes, we said something like this, something pretty simple. The view that happiness equals pleasure. And that's basically right. Basically, the idea is you want to know how happy someone is. It's basically just a matter of looking at how much pleasure they experience, how much pleasure is in their life. That's a little bit of an oversimplification because, as Dan Hayburn says, it's not just a matter of pleasure, but also what he calls unpleasure, or as I'll say in this class, displeasure, where displeasure or unpleasure, it just means unpleasant experience. So according to the hedonist, to figure out how happy someone is, you basically take all the pleasure that they feel and then subtract all the displeasure or unpleasure. And the result of that is level of happiness. And that's it. So we might put it like this. There's a spectrum of degrees of happiness and unhappiness. Down here at one end of the spectrum, it's like all of your experiences are extremely unpleasant. Maybe you're nauseous and you're itchy and you have a horrible headache. Everything is just bad, unpleasant experience. And then all the way at the other end, all your experiences are amazingly pleasant. Maybe you're eating some really good food while receiving a back massage. I don't know. But you're having tons of pleasant experiences. And then down here in the middle is some kind of more normal balance of pleasant and unpleasant experiences. And according to maybe the simplest kind of hedonism, you say, as long as you're on this end of the spectrum, you're in what I'll call the happiness zone. So as long as you're somewhere over here, you count as being happy. Basically, the number is positive. Over here, this would be like -10. Over here would be +10. And here is 0, where you add up all the positive, pleasant experiences and take away the negative experiences. So if that balance is positive, you're experiencing more pleasure than displeasure or unpleasure, then you count as being happy. And that's it. A little bit about what we mean by pleasure and displeasure. There's actually a big debate about this, about what exactly it means for an experience to be pleasant or unpleasant. And this is the question that I wrote my PhD dissertation on. So I'd love to talk your ears off about it. But for now, it's enough to just give a bunch of examples. So all of these things are, I think, examples of things that for most people would be pleasant. Eating chocolate ice cream, finishing a difficult workout, provided you didn't strain yourself, but rather you're like, oh, I'm so glad I did it. 10 reps of whatever. A feeling of satisfaction from hard work well done. So some of these are going to be examples of like sensory experiences, experiences corresponding to taste, touch, sight, smell. And some of them are going to be more emotional experiences, like receiving praise from a mentor. But everything that feels good, everything that feels like a good experience to have, we're going to just call pleasure, that whole category. And everything that feels bad, whether it's a sensory experience, an experience you get from the senses, like eating moldy bread, or if it's more of a intellectual, unpleasant experience, like getting stuck on a difficult math problem and realizing you're stumped and can't figure it out. Everything that feels bad, we're going to call displeasure. And according to the hedonist, you just add all that stuff up. Or you add all of these up that you're feeling, and then subtract everything like this, and that number is how happy you are. And I think there's something to this idea. You know, it's not a ridiculous view. There's a reason that a lot of people think that happiness and pleasure kind of go together. Because think about the best day of your life. Maybe it was a day that you went to some amazing party, or it was a day spent hanging out with friends, doing something really fun. Whatever that day was, you probably had a lot of experiences like this. If you think to the best day of your life, the best day, the happiest day you ever had, the happiest you ever were in your life, it probably doesn't have a lot of things like this. You think, oh, the happiest day of my life, it was that day that I accidentally ate moldy bread and I was insulted by people who cared about me, and I really heard a lot of annoying music all day. It was very irritating. Probably not. Probably the happiest you ever were, you remember stuff like this. Nice experiences to have. So there's something to that. But the question is whether happiness, how happy you are, just depends on experience. That's all it is, that we can just look at the experiences you feel and figure it out on that alone, or whether there's anything more to happiness. So here's a case to think about. Suppose we thought about some things sort of like this. But suppose there's a machine in the near future. They make this machine, and it's called a dream chamber. And it looks like a coffin, I guess, or a bathtub. And you can pay to just lie down in the dream chamber. And when you do, you just lie in this, I don't know, goo or something. Maybe you have some electrodes hooked up to your head. And what the dream chamber does is it causes you to get one of these experiences. So maybe there's like a chocolate ice cream dream chamber. And if you lie down in it, it'll do a couple of things. It'll make you really, really sleepy, so you won't be thinking much. You'll kind of be like, you won't be all the way asleep, but you'll be in a state where you're not really thinking very clearly. As if you were almost falling asleep, but not quite there. You won't have any detailed thoughts. And it'll cause you to have some continuous pleasant experience. So there's the chocolate ice cream dream chamber, and you just go in, you lie down, and then for as long as you're in there, you're just kind of floating, not thinking, but you're having the experience as if you're eating chocolate ice cream. And it's pleasant. It feels good. And it just happens continuously. Continuous, pleasant experience. And maybe you can pay some amount to go into the dream chamber for an hour. Maybe it's like $100 to go in for an hour. or you could pay $1,000 for a day. You could spend a whole day in there. It also it keeps you alive, so you're not going to die in there. And in fact, if you save up enough, you could go in there for your whole life. So suppose somebody does. They think, the dream chamber's pretty nice. You don't feel any anxiety. You don't feel any stress. You don't feel any of these bad experiences while you're in there. So that's where I want to be. And they just save up their whole life. And for their retirement, or maybe at the age of, I don't know, 35 or something, they have enough money saved up that they enter the dream chamber for the rest of their life. So someone spends years, I don't know, 35 to 90 in a dream chamber, having no thoughts, just being kept alive by the machine, and having this continuous experience of eating chocolate ice cream. And they never have thoughts like, I'm getting bored of this. They never think, I wonder how my family is doing, because it keeps them in this state of just kind of not thinking and just experiencing this low, mellow pleasure for a while, forever, until they die of natural causes. So, first question for you all. Just thinking about the person in the dream chamber. If you're a hedonist about happiness, does this person count as happy? First question. Okay, plenty of nods. If you're a hedonist about happiness, how happy is this person? Somebody tell me. How happy would you say this person is if you're a hedonist about happiness? Yeah. Yeah, pretty extremely happy. I mean, no unpleasant experiences and just continuous pleasant experiences. It's like if you looked at the grid of their life, this is most pleasant. Down here's the most unpleasant. For you and me, for us ordinary people, there's probably a lot of this. You know, you have to get up early in the morning. It's really cold. Didn't realize it got so cold in Hong Kong. That's unpleasant. Then you have your first cup of coffee. That's pleasant. Maybe you stub your toe. That's unpleasant. You go back and forth. This guy, no way. All up here. No unpleasant experiences ever, and continuous pleasant experiences. So according to a hedonist, he's not just happy, he's extremely happy. He's really happy. More happy than you or I, maybe anyone. So my question for you is, do you think that's right? If you knew this machine worked, and you knew a friend of yours, for example, had saved up their money, and they were going into the machine, and they were in there now, would you say that they were happy? I'm not looking for a right answer or a wrong answer, but this is the philosophical question to talk about. Raise your hand if you would say, yes, that person is happy. A couple of you, okay. Raise your hands if you would say, no, they're not happy. Okay, fairly even split. Someone who says, no. Why would you say no? Why would you describe this person as not being happy? Somebody who said no.
His pleasures are just too small, not that big enough. Like achievement when you're busy.
Oh, okay, good. So you're already getting ahead. Saw in the reading distinction between deep versus shallow pleasures. Yeah, so intuitively, we can distinguish between the pleasure that you get from eating chocolate ice cream versus the pleasure, as you said, of achievement. Like, what's an example of an achievement that would bring you pleasure?
Getting the reading quiz done.
Getting the reading quiz done, the ultimate source of pleasure. Yeah. And you might think, yeah, okay, there's pleasure, and then there's pleasure. There's the kind of shallow pleasures of chocolate ice cream, and there's the deeper pleasures of completing your quiz for philosophy classes, or for winning the Nobel Prize, any kind of achievement. And this is more relevant to happiness. Why else? Someone else who said you would not describe this person as happy. Why wouldn't you describe them that way? Yes?
So if it is this very case which is continuously eating like chocolate ice cream, so I think he would got bored of this like after a year.
Get bored of it? Good. So this is why we have to clarify. This is why we have to be careful. So you're right. Well, two things. One, he's not actually eating chocolate ice cream. It's just like stimulating his brain. If he was continuously eating ice cream that whole time, he would die pretty quickly. So it's keeping him alive somehow. But also, this is why I clarified that it makes you really sleepy and so you don't think much. So this is a common way to respond to hedonism. A lot of things that give you pleasure, like eating candy or eating ice cream or whatever, eventually, if you keep doing those things, they'll make you have terrible displeasure. You keep eating ice cream, then eventually you'll get a horrible stomachache. If you like, the smell of baking bread is a really nice, pleasant experience, but if you just stand outside a bakery all day and smell that all day, well, you'll get bored pretty fast. So that's why I have to insist that in this case, you won't get bored. That's part of what the machine does. It's science fiction, but that's the idea. It makes it so you don't get tired of it. You don't think about it. You won't even, if someone was brought out of the dream chamber, they wouldn't even know how much time had passed. They're not aware of anything except this kind of dreamlike chocolate ice cream experience. But yeah, so that's an excellent point to bring up, which brings up why we need to be careful to insist you don't get bored or tired or anxious or anything like that. Any other reasons why you wouldn't describe this person as happy?
I mean, he can't choose those pleasures, right?
He can't choose them. Well, he chose them when he picked out this machine. But once you're in there, you're locked in, I guess. And you're not going to make any choices there. So yeah, you might think that that's important too. That being happy involves making choices. All right, more of you, I think, said that you would count him as being happy. Suppose I'm on someone who thinks he's not happy. I say, how can you describe, how can you say he's happy? He's just lying there. He's not doing anything. It's like it's almost as if he's in a coma or a persistent vegetative state. So I don't think he's happy at all. If you were someone, well, and some of you are, you thought we should describe him as happy, what would you say? Those of you who said, yeah, I would call this person happy, what would you say in defense of that? Yeah.
I think like the deep pleasure should not deep pleasure. So you can actually just having the feeling that you have a deep pleasure. So like you can have a feeling like in the so many times you can have a feeling like I'm always completing the quiz.
Nice. Yeah, the ultimate ecstasy. It's just feeling of completing it over and over again. Yeah, it doesn't get any better than that. Good. So we should distinguish between two things here. So, okay, I guess this picture isn't needed then. So let's keep track of where we are. So we have this distinction, deep pleasures versus non-deep pleasures. And one idea is that there's no happiness without deep pleasure. That's an objection. That's an objection against hedonism as we just described. And then the point that you just raised is to say, well, with these deep pleasures, they could just be simulated too, right, by a machine like that? Yeah, good. So we say deep pleasures can be simulated too. The question is whether or not this is saying hedonism is wrong. If I say, or is defending hedonism. So suppose we just adopt the version of hedonism I described. Say, add up all the pleasures, whatever kind of pleasures, and subtract all the displeasures or unpleasure, and that's how happy you are. And then someone responds, well, I don't think you should add up all the pleasures. You should just add up deep pleasures. That's an objection to hedonism. If that's true, then this view is wrong, because we don't just do this. Skipping ahead, actually. Skipping ahead, we say, actually, the other view is wrong. It's this view, that it's just deep pleasure that counts. And you're only happy if you have all experiences extremely pleasant and deep. So if you defend hedonism by saying deep pleasures can be simulated too, there's different things you could mean by that. But the question is whether or not that's opposed to this. So suppose I say, hedonism is false because you shouldn't count up all the pleasures, you should just count up all the deep pleasures. And then somebody else says to me, well, the deep pleasures can be simulated by a dream machine. Instead of doing the chocolate ice cream machine, you can do the reading quiz machine, reading quiz completion machine. The reading quiz machine is like a horrible experience, but the completion one is good. Question is, if I just say that, have I tried, is that a way of saying that this is wrong? Someone says, only count deep pleasures. And I say, deep pleasures can be simulated too. Have I said we shouldn't count? Have I said that this is wrong? That it's not true that we should only count deep pleasures? We're in the weeds already. It gets pretty complicated pretty fast. I'm thinking no. So the idea is we started out with what we could call basic hedonism. Then we have an objection that looks like this, the deep pleasures objection. And the question is, how should the hedonist respond to this deep pleasures objection? What they have to say is, one way or the other, they have to say that all pleasures count, not just deep pleasures. If they admit that only deep pleasures count, then they're saying, okay, this objection is right. And if they just say deep pleasures can be simulated too, that's true. That's true. But it's not saying that, it's not making the case that we should count regular pleasures in addition to deep pleasures. It's just saying that deep pleasures can also be simulated. We could have a different objection. Remember the experience machine objection we talked a while about before? That was the objection that when you're in the machine, things aren't real. You are having a simulation of having a family and friends and things like that. And one objection that you could have to that is to say, well, a mere machine could never give you the experiences someone might respond to the experience machine by saying, a mere machine could never give you the experience of a real family or achievement or whatever. And then, if someone said that, then we could respond and say, hey, actually, that's just an experience too. There's no reason to think that some experiences, like chocolate ice cream, can be created without chocolate ice cream, but the so-called deep experiences of achievement and completing reading quizzes can't be simulated. So we could respond and say, deep pleasures can be simulated too. That would be a response to this objection. But I wonder if we can also have a response to this objection. So this is the objection that says, this guy who's just having the chocolate ice cream experience, he doesn't count as being happy because he doesn't have these experiences that you would get from completing reading quizzes or winning the Nobel Prize. So then you would say, maybe he would be happy if he was in the Nobel Prize machine or the completing reading quizzes machine. But because he's in the chocolate ice cream machine, he doesn't count as being happy. Does that sound right to you? You would be happy if you were in the completing reading quizzes machine, but maybe you wouldn't be happy in the chocolate ice cream machine. Or do you think that there's no difference? Okay, one more time. Show of hands for people who think he would be happy. You would say this guy is happy when he's plugged into the chocolate ice cream machine, just has experiences of chocolate ice cream. Show of hands for that. Okay, keep them up. Now, show of hands if you think he'd be happy if he was in the machine that gives you the feeling of having won the Nobel Prize or fixed a difficult math problem or anything like that. Any additional hands? Okay, cool. So some of you think that chocolate ice cream doesn't count, but Nobel Prize does. And some of you think neither counts. Even if you were in a machine that gave you the deep pleasures of learning and achievement and all that stuff, you still would not count as being happy. So why is that? Why would you say that? Not even the experience of completing a reading quiz would count as being happy. No experience would. Or at least neither that nor the chocolate ice cream experience. What do you think? Why might you say that? Your friend says, I'm going to be so happy. I'm going to be happy for the rest of my days. As soon as I hit 35, I'm going to plug in, and I'll be in there for the next 45 years. No, 55 years. And I'll be super happy. It'll be like I'm completing a reading quiz every 10 seconds. Why would you think? Why might you think you won't really be happy? That doesn't count as happiness. Well, it seems like most of you already think. Most of you seem like you're on team hedonists in that you're going to say that would count as happiness, both that and the chocolate ice cream. And even those who thought chocolate ice cream wouldn't count, most of you thought that reading quiz pleasures would count. So I guess I'm kind of stacking the deck against myself by asking that, because most of you don't think, most of you would agree that he would count as being happy. But Dan Habron does not. So that's what we're going to talk about. So the objection that he has, the reason he thinks that hedonistic theories don't count, is a little bit different than any of the ones that we considered. He does refer to what we call deep pleasures, but the way that he describes them, or the reasons that he gives for thinking that they don't contribute towards happiness, are maybe a little bit different than the ones that we've considered. He says they need not have the slightest impact on one's level of happiness, though they may. I enjoy or get pleasure from a cheeseburger, yet I'm patently not happier thereby. So it looks like this for him. We already have kind of talked about this sort of thing, where we've got some pleasures that are maybe unrelated to happiness. And that would be like just the experience of eating chocolate ice cream, perhaps, if you thought that that was unrelated to happiness. And he's exploiting this fact about hedonism. Namely, hedonism doesn't just say that a pleasant life is a happy life. I mean, that is one thing hedonists say, that if you have a happy life, then that must be because over the course of your life, there's more pleasure than displeasure. But hedonists also say that every little bit of increased pleasure is a little bit of increased happiness. Whenever you feel a little bit more pleasant experience, you also feel a little bit happier. And Hebron is saying, that's not true, because I can eat a cheeseburger, I feel some pleasure, but I'm not any happier. So here's the idea. Here's the argument. So this is a person who will say is very unhappy. It's the unhappiest person that I could find eating crackers, as that's his example. So you've got someone who is very irritable, very miserable, always dissatisfied with everybody, very unhappy, perhaps very lonely, cranky, all that. Very unhappy person, but they have a plate of crackers. And so the first premise is that if hedonism about pleasure is true, then getting a little bit of pleasure from eating crackers necessarily makes you happier. So this person, she's eating some crackers, and they're fine, they're okay. You get like a little bit of pleasure from eating a salty cracker. And if you get a little bit of pleasure, then according to hedonism, you're a little bit happier. But Dan Hebron says, getting the pleasure from eating the cracker does not necessarily make you happier. So you could have this little boost in pleasure without any corresponding boost in happiness. So he thinks hedonism is false. So it's like this. We've got a very miserable, irritable person. They're eating a cracker. Therefore, they get some little pleasant experience. And Hebron is saying there's two things that could happen. It could be that this person is munching on the crackers and they're like, you know what? The world's not so bad. I feel a little bit better. They feel a little less miserable and irritable, maybe just for a minute or two, but their mood lifts a little bit. They're a little bit less grumpy and irritable. Hebron says, yeah, sure, that's something that could happen. But it's just as possible that they remain just as miserable and lonely and irritable the whole time. Their mood doesn't lift at all. So they get a little bit of pleasure from eating the crackers, but in terms of their emotional experience of like, I hate everything, I hate the whole world, that doesn't change. That just remains continuous. And he's saying, if this can happen, that someone's emotions don't change, their mood doesn't lift when they get a little bit of pleasure from eating a cracker, then that means pleasure doesn't necessarily increase happiness, so hedonism is false. So I wonder what you think. I wonder what you think about that argument. And I want to clarify that although we're reading Dan Hebron's book, I'm not trying to pass down Dan Hebron's wisdom and get everybody to just accept whatever he says. This is a conversation over WhatsApp with my wife-to-be, who's also a philosopher. And I was asking her about this objection. She responds, "This literally seems like crazy talk to me. What do you mean? Every time I eat cake, I'm like, this makes me happy." So I said, I think this objection is kind of interesting, kind of plausible that you could get a little bit of pleasure. I was very taken aback by her response. I did ask her immediately after this, can I use this for my slides on pleasure and happiness? And she said yes. But she's a reasonable person too. So there's room for agreement or disagreement. I don't mean to be saying, I'm not giving you these arguments so that you just accept them. I want to dig down into them and think about why we might accept them or reject them. So what I want you to do for like 2 minutes is talk to the people around you, the people at your table, and talk about, suppose you are a hedonist. Just pretend you're a hedonist about happiness. So you think, I have to argue against this argument. I have to show that Dan Habern is wrong. For some of you, that will be easy because it seems like you are hedonists about happiness. But either way, pretend you are, and think about how you would respond to this argument. You have to show that it's wrong somewhere. And I'll walk around and talk to you as you do. But we'll do maybe 3 or 4 minutes to do that, and then we'll reconvene and talk about it. Clear on what we're doing? Cool. Do you feel like you... Yeah, sorry, go ahead. You disagree with hedonism?
Yes, I think happiness is subjective. You can't tell by the person's appearance, like the gesture. Like even if they show, the person show they're unhappy, but in the inner heart they may be happy. So I can't.
Right. Well, the hedonist says, yeah, you can't tell. You can't tell just by looking at somebody, because it's all about what they're feeling, the experience that they're having. So the hedonist doesn't say, yeah, you can just look at them and tell. They say, it depends on what they're feeling. So it sounds like you agree with that.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry, I misunderstand.
Oh, okay. But yeah, so they're saying it depends on how you're feeling, and it depends in like a specific way. It's just how many good, pleasant feelings you have, minus however many bad feelings you have. And in this case, this very grumpy person gets an additional pleasant experience, but she's not really any happier because she's still just as grumpy and irritable as before. So a hedonist can't accept that. They say, if you get more pleasure, you must be a little bit happier. So I'll leave you to it. First of all, something I want to clarify. You might not know this, probably don't know this. The most common, if you go to a philosophy conference or you go to a philosophy talk, we have weekly philosophy talks here, there'd be a talk and then there'd be a Q&A. And what do you think is like the most common question that people ask during a philosophy Q&A? I don't know how you would know. So I don't know why I'm pausing. But the most common question is a question that starts with something like, I didn't understand, or could you please clarify? In some fields, in some other subjects, maybe you wouldn't say things like this quite so often. Like if I'm a surgeon giving a presentation on a kind of surgery, and people are asking questions like this, the other surgeons, you might be a little bit worried. Like, can we clarify what we're even doing here? What were you, this organ I'm not really familiar with? That would be bad. Philosophy is very common. We're talking about like quite abstract things. So if you feel like I don't understand what's going on, or I'm not clear on why you showed this WhatsApp conversation with your partner. it's totally fine to raise your hand and say, and I hope you do, hope you feel empowered to raise your hand and say, could you clarify this? Or I didn't understand this. Could you say a little bit more about that? If you do that, you will be acting like professional philosophers at a philosophy talk. And I am very used to dealing with those sorts of questions. So before we start to talk about the objection and how you might respond to it if you're a hedonist, does anyone have any questions like that? Anything they feel, I didn't understand why you were talking about this, or I wasn't clear on anything at all? It's okay. If you ever feel like lost, if you ever feel like you're losing track of what we're talking about, I guarantee that multiple other people in the room probably feel the same way. And they would all be deeply appreciative if you would ask the question, as would I, because I'm looking around and being like, do people understand what I just said? Should I move to the next thing? Or if I say this again, am I just repeating myself? Or so I would appreciate it too. Don't have to right now, but I just wanted you to know. Okay, so somebody tell me something that came up when you were talking to each other just now about this argument. How you might respond to it or what you thought about it. I talked to some of you, but obviously not all of you. So somebody tell me what you talked about in your group. I know I'm not giving these out at this time. I will at the end. I just can't be walking. I don't want to make things too difficult. What do you think? Yes?
So like, I think sometimes the boundary between like pleasant and unpleasant experience could be like subjective and like vague. So like, for example, if I like eating like spicy food or like pineapples. So like, pineapples, when you finish eating them, sometimes they will make your mouth like stinky and uncomfortable. But like if you
Really?
enjoy eating it, so it's kind of like an unpleasant and a pleasant experience at the same time. So like, is it just like a balance between those, or is it down to like your own subjective thought that a pleasant or unpleasant experience make you happy?
Okay, good. So, yeah. So that's a question like about what pleasure even is, or how do we draw the distinction between pleasure versus displeasure? Where do we draw the line? What are they? So, is it subjective? Yeah, so like I said, this is a big question in philosophy that people talk about. What is the nature of pleasure? Stuff like that. And I just kind of set it aside for when we were talking about it now. But it's a good question to ask if you're talking about hedonism, because if the hedonist can't answer, if they can't say what pleasure is or how to distinguish it from displeasure, then they're in big trouble, right? Because their whole view is about pleasure is happiness. And then if you ask, well, what is pleasure? I like the taste of pineapple, but some people don't because it makes their mouth feel weird or whatever. And they're like, I don't know. I don't know. I can't tell you. Then they're in bad shape. So that could be a problem for hedonism if they can't distinguish. But let's just grant that in this case, ooh, terrible color to put on there. Oh well. That in this case, let's just grant, or let's just assume that the crackers, she actually does get pleasure from eating the crackers. Let's just assume that for now. Maybe you or I wouldn't like them, but she really does get pleasure as a result of eating crackers. So let's assume that the hedonist can answer this question, how to draw the distinction. So they say, yeah, she does get pleasure, But according to Dan Habron, she's not necessarily happier. What might they say about that? Talk to some of you. Would you mind saying what you said to me? Because it was a good point.
I think maybe like the pleasure that I gain from eating crackers is just temporary. But you can be a person that very grumpy, but you can have a temporary pleasure at the same time. But I don't think a temporary pleasure can make you become a happier person.
Good. So, so we're distinguishing between being a happy person and maybe what you might call like feeling happy. So you could say, maybe we could say, well, look, yeah, so this person, they're very grumpy, very irritable. They eat a cracker. They feel a little bit of pleasure. We can say to Dan Habron, yeah, that does not make them a happy person. Everyone should agree about that. Eating one cracker, if you're a cranky person, is not going to probably like cause a ray of light to shine down on you and make you change your mood and become a happy person from now on. Unless it's a really good cracker. But if it's a regular cracker, it's not going to be a life-changing experience. You're not going to become a happy person. So we could say, it won't make you a happier person. Maybe we could say, the reason Dan Habron thinks that P2 is true, that this second premise is true, maybe he thinks that this is true because he's thinking getting pleasure from eating crackers does not necessarily make you a happier person. But, so we're here defending the hedonist. The hedonist could say, yeah, that's true. It doesn't make you a happier person, but it does make you feel a little happier. And so hedonism is still okay. Maybe that's one response that you could have. That you feel that, yes, you feel a little bit happier, but it doesn't make you a happier person. So Dan Habron thinks that this is true because when he says it does not necessarily make you happier, what he's thinking really is it does not necessarily make you a happier person. And that's true. But it does necessarily make you feel happier. That's a possible response. So let's just consider next time I'll bring the blue marker. Is that utterly illegible? I think it's not great. Suppose this just said, getting pleasure from eating crackers does not necessarily make you feel happier. So we're thinking the hedonist has to say that's false. The hedonist has to say getting, oh, thanks. Necessary, I will. The hedonist has to say getting pleasure from eating crackers does necessarily make you feel happier. Does anyone agree with the hedonist on this? Or do you think, no, getting pleasure from eating crackers does not make you necessarily feel happier? What do you think? Or other responses to this argument that you considered in your group. We went off on a tangent pretty quickly, but I didn't get to talk to any of you on this side. So whatever you talked about in your group, What do you think? Where that can include things like, in my group, we talked about how we did not understand what was happening on this slide, and we just asked each other if anyone did understand, and everyone said no. That would be fine too. Yes?
You make us feel pressure if we feel pressure because when we feel pressure. Like when you feel pressure and but you didn't feel pressure just because you are experiencing something that you feel unhappy.
So, sorry.
For example, when you eating pressure, it although even you feel pressure, but like when your family members die, like of course you will feel sad, but and even though this pressure when you feel some pressure and you feel happier, but yeah, your family members to die, so you will not make you feel happy.
I see. Okay, good. Another good distinction. So we can distinguish between being a happy person and feeling happy. And we can distinguish a bit between being happier, like I'm happier today than I was yesterday, or happier now that I'm eating this cracker than I was a little bit before that. We can distinguish between that and just being happy. So if we go back to this, if I was here 5 minutes ago, and now I'm here, before I was at this point on the spectrum, now I'm at this point, I'm happier than I was before, right? Am I happy if I'm here on the spectrum? No. Just because I'm happier than I was doesn't mean I'm happy. Similarly, suppose I was like 2 feet tall and then I grew a foot. I'd be taller than I was before, but I wouldn't be tall because 3 feet is not tall either. So going back to this argument, this says doesn't necessarily make you happier. So if that said, if we interpreted that as this, getting pleasure from eating crackers does not necessarily make you happy, getting pleasure from eating crackers does not necessarily make you happy. True or false, would you say? If we just put it that way. Show of hands for true. Show of hands for false. I mean, it's a philosophy class, so there's room for disagreement about a lot of things. But yeah, I think it would be extremely plausible. Because eating crackers, if anything, it moves you a little bit further. But like the point you just made, if, you know, your family just died or something, if your girlfriend or boyfriend just left you and you just discovered that you have a terrible disease and, I don't know, there was like everyone in the world was dying, but then you have this cracker. Well, it's probably not going to do much for you. Maybe it'll make you a little bit happier, but it's definitely not going to bring you all the way to happy. So, you're right. If this just means makes you happy, it's definitely false. But Dan Habern is just saying, not just does it not necessarily make you happy, it doesn't even necessarily make you happier. It doesn't even necessarily boost you even a little, bring you any further. Say it's like totally unhappy, to super happy. Dan Habern is not saying that eating a cracker will not put you over here. He's saying it won't even bring you any further to the right. It won't make you any happier. And the hedonist has to disagree. The hedonist says, if you feel any pleasure, it might not bring you all the way over to the happiness side of the spectrum, but it will push you a little bit to the right. What do you think? What came up while you were talking about this?
We are kind of wondering if we can defend Hedonism in a way that, because it's the value of happiness is kind of like a mathematical equations. So like your feeling of pleasure minus the feeling of unpleasure. Then if it's a positive result, then you feel happier. But could it be the case that like when I eat crackers, I do really feel I have some pleasure, but at the same time, I kind of like it reminds me some of the trauma that I maybe gained from the crackers. So like the results of like having the pleasure of having the crackers and the unpleasant experience of the trauma, they just like balance it with each other. So like the results can change for.
Good. So, yeah, that's an excellent point. Yet another distinction we can draw. So remember we talked about essential versus instrumental claims, right? This is kind of closely related to that, because the point you're making is, let's see. I've been talking like that the hedonist definitely has to disagree with this, because the hedonist has to say that getting pleasure from eating crackers does necessarily make you happier. But the point you're raising is, what if I have some cracker-related trauma in my background, and so I have this brief experience of pleasure from eating the cracker, but then it brings back all the memories of, I don't know, maybe I was chased by a person in a cracker mascot, and it scarred me for life. And now when I taste crackers, I just think about the fear, or something like that. That would be a case where I get the pleasure, but it does not necessarily make me happier, even according to the hedonist. Because you're right, so it's like +1 cracker pleasure, and then -100 cracker trauma experience. And so that would be a case where the hedonist would say, yeah, actually, not only does it not move you forward, it moves you back. So if we really want to be careful, this is a good lesson to learn. Often to make these objections work in arguments against some particular philosophical view, we have to be really careful about the details. We have to be really specific. So in this example, to make this work as an objection against hedonism, strictly speaking, we have to say, getting pleasure from eating crackers does not necessarily make you happier, even when it doesn't cause any displeasure. If it did cause displeasure, because I have cracker-related trauma, then the hedonist could agree. They could say, oh yeah, sure. Yeah, if you were chased by a guy in a cracker mascot, then of course, getting pleasure from eating crackers won't necessarily make you happier. To make sure that the objection works, we have to set things up so the hedonist doesn't have any kind of escape route like that. So we have to close it off by saying, and I'm sure Dan Habern would say this, say, no. I'm saying set aside, even if there's no displeasure at all, it's just pleasure. They just get a little bit of pleasure from eating the cracker, and they get no displeasure whatsoever. Say, still, it might not move you at all to the right. That little bit of pleasure might not affect your happiness at all. Not saying I agree or that you have to agree, but just want to be clear about what he's saying. And I think the idea here is that if you remember, we talked very briefly about what actual kind of view Dan Hebron accepts as a little preview of where he's going in this book. He thinks that happiness has to do with your more long-term emotions. So that's why I specified the two possibilities in this way. He would say, well, look, if she experiences pleasure and that changes her mood, she becomes less irritable, less prone to lashing out at people, less lonely, less grumpy. Those are changes in emotion. Those are changes in long-term patterns, like moods and emotions. When we talk about happiness, we're not just talking about, some little moment of pleasure that you get from eating a cracker, or from briefly smelling baking bread as you're walking around. We talk about happiness. That's like a long-term mood. You're not happy for like a second. It's more of a deep psychological thing than that, not just something that happens and then it's done. So he's thinking many pleasures like the pleasures of eating crackers, they're just not part of any emotion. Yeah, that's the basic idea. Happiness is an emotion. And the feeling of eating a cracker, that's not like part of any emotion. There's no cracker emotion. It's just like a brief experience that you have and then it's done. It feels nice, but it doesn't make a difference to what your overall emotions are. Any more than, like if I stub my toe, that might cause me to become angry. I might get really pissed off because I stubbed my toe. But the pain in my toe is not like literally anger. It's not part of an anger. Feeling anger is not the same as having pain in your toe. He's thinking it's basically the same thing here. You have this nice little brief taste experience, but it's not literally part of what it is to be happy. It's not part of the emotion. And you might disagree. Yeah. She says, every time I eat cake, I'm like, this makes me happy. I'm happier because of this cake. Dan Hebron might respond and say, yeah, it might cause you to feel happy. It might cause some change in the emotion, but it's not actually part of it. Okay, we're almost out of time, but I just want to introduce the next part of this. So we only got about halfway through this one chapter. But that argument that I just gave you, as you know from the reading, that is like Dan Hebron's main reason, his main objection to thinking that pleasure is happiness. He thinks, yeah, some pleasures, like the ones you get from eating a cracker, they're just too brief, they don't make for any change in your emotions, and so they don't count. But normally in philosophy, if you convince someone, if you've got a good objection to someone, like if I'm a hedonist and someone has a good objection to me, and I have to admit, I'm forced to admit, okay, your objection works. Philosophers are very stubborn. You don't just throw up your hands and say, okay, I'm not a hedonist anymore. You say instead, what's the smallest change I can make so that I can admit that you were right about that, but I'm still basically right about everything else. And so that's the next part of this. He thinks, okay, so I'm going to assume that my hedonist opponent recognizes that I won, that this was a good argument, that eating crackers doesn't necessarily make you happier, so therefore pleasure isn't the same thing as happiness. And he thinks, but I know what they're going to do. They're going to want to try to change their view just a little bit. And this brings us back to the thing we talked about at the very start of the class, which is that they might want to distinguish between what we call deep pleasures and what? Non-deep pleasures. They might say, okay, yeah, Dan Haberin, you're right. Eating a cracker doesn't necessarily make you any happier, but that's because that's just a shallow pleasure. But a deep pleasure is going to count. So instead of just adding up all the pleasures and subtracting the displeasures, we're just going to add up all the deep pleasures and subtract the displeasures. And that'll tell you how happy they are. And the reason that the old woman doesn't get any happier is because she gets another pleasure, she gets a new experience of pleasure, but it's not a deep pleasure. And what is a deep pleasure? Well, it's like take my list from before and then cross off all the sensory experiences. So eating chocolate ice cream, that doesn't count. Eating an apple, the feeling of settling into bed, maybe that doesn't count either. It's going to be just like intellectual, more sophisticated feelings, emotional feelings, like meeting your friend that you really like, or gazing up at a starry sky and thinking deep thoughts about your place in the universe with pleasure. Receiving praise from someone you care about. So basically, deep pleasures are going to be things other than the senses, but other sources of more emotional pleasure. So according to what we call restricted hedonism, the version of hedonism that says, no, it's all about deep pleasure, they're going to say, yeah, the pleasure of eating crackers doesn't count, but still, happiness totally overlaps with this subcategory of deep pleasure. And we'll think more about how Dan Haberin is going to try to demolish that view as well next time. And for now, I got to leave you all. So thanks, everybody, and I will see you on Tuesday.